We're about to take a trip back in time, way back, over 3,000 years ago, to an era that didn't just shape a country, but really laid the groundwork for a global civilization. This is the story of the Vedic Age. It's a tale of people on the move, of cultures colliding, and of a spiritual revolution that would, believe it or not, change the world forever. So, let's dive right in.
It really all boils down to this one question. Who are the people who wrote one of the oldest, most sacred texts in human history? Well, the answer points us to a group who called themselves the Aryans. And our story really kicks off with their arrival in the Indian subcontinent right around 1500 BCE.
All right, so our first stop is the very beginning of this age. We're going to follow a people who are constantly on the move, tracing their journey into a new land, a place they would completely transform, and a place that would in turn completely transform them.
Okay, so to get our bearings, let's just look at the timeline. We're talking about a huge chunk of time, almost 1,000 years, and it's really split into two main phases. First up, you have the early Vedic period, from about 1500 to 1000 BCE. Think of this as the age of migration, defined by their oldest text, the Rigveda. Then, around 1000 BCE, everything starts to shift. We enter the later Vedic period. This is an era of settling down, of expansion, and some pretty radical changes that set the stage for the epic period that comes next.
So, where did these folks even come from? Well, this map here shows the most widely accepted theory. If you look on the left, you see the big picture, all these different Indo-European tribes spreading out from the Eurasian steppes. Now, if you follow just one of those branches, the one on the right, you see the group we call the Indo-Aryans, making their way through the massive Hindu Kush mountains and down into the plains of India.
But, and this is really important, this whole thing is a super complex historical puzzle. While that Central Asian theory, the one from scholar Max Muller, is the one you hear about most often, it is definitely not the only one. Other major thinkers have suggested origins as wild as Tibet or even the Arctic region, which just goes to show you how much debate there still is about this ancient migration.
Now, here's a crucial point. The Aryans did not arrive in an empty land, not by a long shot. They ran into indigenous peoples who the Rigveda calls the Dasa or Dasyus, and the relationship, well, it was often hostile. This very quote from their own sacred text talks about the slaughter of the Dasyus, which gives us some pretty stark evidence of a violent clash that really defined the start of the Vedic Age.
So, you can imagine that living in this kind of conflict-filled world would profoundly shape how you see things. So now let's jump into that world using their earliest text, the Rigveda, as our guide. What we find inside is this incredible, vivid picture of a society built around two things: herding and hymns. It's all about cattle, clans, and the awesome forces of nature.
So the key thing to get here is that early Vedic society was, at its heart, tribal. Your loyalty was to your jana, or your tribe. Their economy wasn't based on land. It was all about cattle. In fact, their word for war, gavishti, literally means a search for cows. How crazy is that? Power was held by a tribal chief, the Rajan, but even he had to answer to popular assemblies. They were always on the move.
And to really get inside their heads, you just need to remember one number: 250. That's how many hymns in the Rigveda are dedicated to a single god, Indra. He wasn't just some god of thunder. He was their celestial warlord, the fort destroyer, the one who led them to victory in battle.
But it wasn't just Indra. Their whole early pantheon of gods was basically nature, just supersized. You had Agni, the god of fire, who was like a messenger to the heavens. There was Varuna, who kept the whole cosmos in order. And then there was Soma, this mysterious plant whose juice was a huge part of their most sacred rituals.
But this world of nomadic herders, it wasn't going to last forever. Around 1000 BCE, a huge migration started as the Indo-Aryans pushed eastward into the super-fertile Gangetic Plain. Literally everything about their society was about to change.
Just look at this comparison. The change was absolutely fundamental. Life went from the pasture to the plowed field, from herding to settled farming. And all of a sudden, land became way more important than cattle, which means for the very first time, people had to deal with things like property lines, ownership, and who gets the land when you die. This shift paved the way for a much more complex economy.
And when the economy changes, politics is right there behind it. That old tribal chief, the Rajan, he became a full-blown territorial king, a samrat. Those early kind of democratic assemblies, they lost their power as kings started using these huge, elaborate rituals, like the famous horse sacrifice, to prove they controlled a specific piece of land. And it's right at this point that the word Rashtra,
which means territory or state, shows up in the texts for the first time.
And maybe the most lasting change of all happened in the social structure. As society settled down and got more complicated, people needed to specialize. This is what led to the pretty fluid society of the early days hardening into the rigid four-tiered Varna system. You had the Brahmanas, the priests at the top, then the Kshatriya warriors, the Vaishya commoners, and finally the Shudra laborers. This whole hierarchy became hereditary, fixed at birth. And at the same time, the status of women who used to participate in public assemblies started to go downhill.
So you're probably asking, how on earth do we know all of this? Well, our main source is this incredible library of knowledge the Vedic people left behind. This huge collection of texts that gives us a direct window into their world.
You know, the word Veda itself comes from the Sanskrit root for knowledge. But this wasn't just any kind of knowledge, not like from a textbook. These texts were considered Shruti, which means that which is heard or divinely revealed. For centuries, they were never even written down. They were passed down orally from teacher to student with incredible precision.
At the very heart of this ocean of literature are the four primary Vedas. These are the foundational scriptures that give the entire age its name, and each one had its own unique job to do.
Let's do a quick rundown. Each of the four Vedas has a very specific role. The Rigveda is the oldest and most important. It's just this huge collection of hymns praising the gods. The Somaveda is basically a songbook, setting those hymns to music for chanting. The Yajurveda is more of a how-to guide, a book of prayers and instructions for performing sacrifices. And then you have the Atharva Veda, which gives us this amazing peek into everyday life with all its spells, charms, and folk beliefs.
But they didn't stop there. Over centuries, new layers of interpretation were added on. Think of the core Vedas, the Samhitas, as the foundation. Then came the Brahmanas, which explained all the complex rituals. After that, you get the Aranyakas, or forest texts, which dove into mysticism and symbolism. And finally, you have the Upanishads, these profound philosophical conversations that form the basis of what's now called Vedanta, or the end of the Veda.
And all of this brings us to our final and honestly our most important point. The Vedic age never really ended. Its ideas, its social structures, its spiritual questions, they've all echoed down through thousands of years, and they've profoundly shaped not just India, but the entire world.
The legacy of this age is just immense. It's almost impossible to overstate. It laid the philosophical groundwork for Hinduism, giving us ideas like dharma and karma. Its social framework, the Varna system, has cast a very long shadow over Indian society. This era also gave birth to India's two great epics, the Ramayana and Mahabharata. And even the idea of Gotra, or lineage, which millions of people still use today, has its roots right here in this ancient period.
And the vehicle that carried all of this knowledge through the ages was Sanskrit, the sacred language of the Aryans. The script you're looking at here, Devanagari, is used to write Sanskrit and tons of modern languages across India. It's a living, breathing link right back to that ancient world.
So, we end up right back where we started, with a question. From our social hierarchies to our spiritual beliefs, the changes that happened during the Vedic age set things in motion that are still shaping our world right now. It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? How much of our present is still being defined by a past that's 3,000 years old?